Well, let me start off this evening by thanking you all for coming to what looks like a packed house, understandably. I've had the great pleasure of reading this book, and it's terrific. I remember having the experience in the winter of 1977 of reading a paperback version of The Great Bridge, the epic story of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and turning to my partners who looked at me with astonishment and a sense of my impending madness when I said, I want to make a film about this, the history of the Brooklyn Bridge, and they sort of shook their head. That was my opportunity 38 years ago to meet the gentleman to my left. He has had a profound influence on all that I've done because he's taught me so much about how you tell a story and so much about how writing is done, how you translate complex information for a general popular audience that helps stitch our country together, the way you also edit things together and spend time in archives. So I, in many ways, feel both privileged but also unqualified. I thought maybe one thing qualified me for this evening's conversation, and that is that my parents honeymooned at Kitty Hawk in 1950, and therefore I feel that I have some expertise in aviation. The one thing I want, this is a phenomenal book, and David, as I read it, I remember the excitement and the momentum that I had back in 1977 when I read The Great Bridge. It had that kind of all-encompassing, big arm around stuff. And I think the first question I want to ask is maybe two parts. One, what's central to this book is the surviving archival record, the extraordinary letters that were written, the diaries that were kept, the materials and stuff of life, the receipts and the contracts and all of the things that we are in the process and the various things that we do in the process of distilling. And what a marvelous record it might be. Looking across all of your work, it seems to me that you take or attempt to take and put your arm around or try to get in touch with an American exceptionalism, a very loaded term today because it's used by various folks either to be against or for, but we don't quite really understand it. There's something essentially American, something happened between these two oceans. And your books, without ever straying into the hagiographic, without ever becoming Pollyanna-ish, meaning that you're willing to lift up the rug and tell the dark side and understand there are shadows to these extraordinary stories in broad relief. This is about something of the American character. And there's something really unique about it. And it's a theme that runs through all of the people and the institutions and the events that you've captured. So big archives and big subject, us.
How about that? Yep.
Good. My second question.
Now, before I attempt to move on with those thoughts, I'd like to tell you about something that happened to me just a short while back in Boston, where we have an apartment in the Back Bay, and it was during the horrendous month of February. And we would make marketing lists when the time came up, we dared go out to get provisions in order to survive. And we did one list, and I set off for Shaw's Market, which is a big supermarket right in Back Bay. And I love to go to the market. That's a weird thing, I know, but I really love it. And I'd found everything on the list except cashew nuts. And I couldn't for the life of me find them. And a young fellow went by, comparatively young fellow, with a Shaw's Market shirt on. And I asked him, would you please tell me where the cashew nuts are? And he said, yes, follow me. So I went with him, and he showed me where they were. And I thanked him very much. And about 10 or 15 minutes later, I was checking out at the cash register, and he came up to me again. He said, excuse me, But that voice, have you ever done voices for television? I said, yes, I have. He said, were you the narrator of Ken Burns' Civil War series? And I said, yes, that's right. He said, well, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because that was on the air at a time when I was suffering terribly from insomnia. All I had to do was listen to your voice, and I went right on. Yes, the archival material for this American story of the Wright brothers is phenomenal. It's not just that they have survived, but that there are well over 1,000 letters dealing only with their professional world and their professional struggle. And then there are over 1,000 letters that are private family correspondence or diaries. And they were raised in a family where great emphasis was placed by their father on the use of the English language, both on paper and when up on one's feet. And the letters are not only extraordinary in what they reveal and how intimate they become, but also the quality of the thinking and the use of vocabulary and all the rest. And what is so humbling and at the same time stimulating and encouraging is that neither of them ever finished high school. And their capacity to express themselves is surpassing, as was their sister's ability to write. And it's the letters correspondence between the father, who was an itinerant minister, and the sister and the two brothers that makes it possible to get inside their lives as human beings, not just as phenomenal accomplishments, the creators of a phenomenal accomplishment. And yes, this is indeed a powerful American story, and it is, in my view, a story with numerous lessons for all of us. I think one of the virtues of history is that it serves as an antidote for the hubris of the present. And it reminds us constantly of the extraordinary people who went before us, whose accomplishments have made it a different world, and in a world in which we benefit enormously. And we owe them far more gratitude than we're commonly used to expressing, or that is commonly taught. And when we also understand how hard they worked, and these two brothers are a perfect example of that. It wasn't just that they were brilliant, but they worked extremely hard and never, ever let failure, setbacks, disappointments, near-death incidents stop them from pursuing what they intended to accomplish. They had purpose, high purpose. I don't mean that as a bad pun, high purpose. And this in itself was their way of finding happiness. They were never happier than when they were on the job, and particularly when the job was getting tough. And they weren't in it to make life easier or softer or to get rich or any of those things. They're pursuing a wonderful, ambitious, admirable achievement. And they did it alone, without any backing. No backing from a university, no money or support from a foundation, no wealthy benefactor, no pull in high places, no political pull, and no money. All of their expenses they had to cover themselves from the receipts, from the proceeds from their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. But even if they hadn't succeeded, I would have wanted to have written this book. So revealing, so intensely human is their human story. And so much of a reminder of standards of behavior and ambition, worthy ambition, that we need to be reminded of, because that's part of our story,
Mm-hmm.
should be part of our continuing story.
There's a wonderful moment early in the book when you quote, paraphrase Wilbur as saying, in order to get ahead in life, you need to pick a good father and mother and then live in Ohio.
Yeah, right.
So
That's
can
exactly
you
right.
just paint a sense of what Ohio meant in the late 19th century in terms of its ability to incubate not just aviators, but presidents, and it seemed to be a place. I mean, I still live in New England where the rocks keep growing up in the soil. A lot of smarter people left for the Ohio Valley.
Yeah. Well, there's something particularly American about the Ohio story. And it's, when you look at who came from Ohio and what they did, it's quite remarkable. Presidents, inventors, and there's a strange coincidence, and maybe it isn't a coincidence, that the first human being ever to fly in a flying machine, Orville Wright, and the first human being ever to set foot on the moon came from the same section of southwestern Ohio, Neil Armstrong. And then, of course, John Glenn also came from Ohio, as did Edison, as did numerous other people in that very protein time. You kindly mentioned my book about the Brooklyn Bridge. I see this book as the third in a trilogy about phenomenal accomplishment, quite aside from politics or the military. The first being the Brooklyn Bridge, the second being the Panama Canal, and now this accomplishment by the Wright brothers. All three were, in theory, technical accomplishments, but all three were also far much more than that, involving far much more than just technical expertise. All three involved many people. They were all three calling upon phenomenal courage because it was very dangerous work in which people were killed. And all three changed the world in their way. And all three, of course, had to do with transportation, but that was because the world was expanding, and then the world really expanded with aviation. Last year, 2014, one airport in this country, and not necessarily the biggest or the busiest, O'Hare Field, 70 million people flew in and out of O'Hare Field. Most of them would then travel at 35 to 40,000 feet, taking it quite for granted that this was perfectly normal. But seldom ever wondering, well, how did it happen? Who did it? Who made it happen? There's a scene, and you remember it, I know we've talked about it, in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where they're being followed by the posse.
Who are those?
And they keep saying, well, who are those guys?
Who are those guys?
Because they won't give up. They won't stop.
Right.
And in my feeling, when I read about the Roeblings, who built the Brooklyn Bridge, or the people who were involved with building the Panama Canal, and the Wright brothers, I think, who were those guys? And how the hell did they do it? And what can we learn from them? What can we take to heart to be savored and passed on a value that they taught us by how they conducted their lives?
You know, we live in a media culture. Everything is way too much information to curate, digest, certainly. And what information we think we do have is mostly superficial. So the Wright brothers, if Americans can name who started this thing, and possibly two guys, Wilbur and Orville. But what's so amazing about your book is that these people come fully alive. Their father, Milton, the bishop, the sister Catherine, but these two guys, the mother who died early of tuberculosis, I believe at age 58, Susan, had sort of identified in these two of her sons, the two youngest of her sons, something going on.
Yes.
What was that? And can you just give us, paint a little bit of a portrait of both of these remarkable human beings, because they are extremely alike and extremely different in temperament and personality and achievement and the roles they played, and set them so they're not just that superficial Orville and Wilbur, I win that Jeopardy contest.
Well, they seemed to many people like identical twins, and they sounded so much alike that if they were in another room and you heard one of them talking, you couldn't tell which was which. Their handwriting looks almost identical. They lived in the same house. They ate 3 meals a day together. They worked together in the same shop all day long, and they worked together on this extracurricular crusade they determined for themselves. But they were quite different. Orville the older was, in my view and the view of others, unquestionably a genius, bona fide genius. Orville, who was 4.5, almost 5 years younger, was inventive and innovative mechanically, and bright as can be, but he was not what his brother Orville was, and Orville was the leader. He was the big brother, and what he said was what they did. Wilbur was the big brother. Orville was very shy, painfully shy, as their mother had been. Whereas Wilbur, though he didn't like to court the limelight, in fact, he tried to avoid the limelight, was a brilliant speaker. He could stand in front of an audience, a professional group, or a group of eminent engineers and intellectuals in Paris, and give a talk that no professor or presidential speechwriter of our day could possibly equal. And again, neither went to college. Orville could get moody. They called him in the family as his peculiar spells, where he would get overtired and touchy and we would say depressed. But it wouldn't last long. They could argue something fierce and wind up each taking the side that the other one had at the beginning of the argument.
As only brothers can do.
Yes, and that was one of their ways of working a problem out, figuring out the solution to a problem. They're always figuring out solutions to problems. And seemingly insoluble problems, problems that the greatest minds in all history hadn't been able to figure out. One of the keys to their success was that they realized it was one thing to invent a flying machine, but it was another thing to fly the flying machine. Now, part of that, of course, comes from the very, we take it to be common sense experience of bicycle riding. You can't explain to someone how to ride a bicycle. They have to get on the bicycle and ride it, learn to balance. Such people as Octave Chanute, who was a great glider expert and enthusiast, or Samuel Langley, the head of the Smithsonian, one of the most brilliant scientists of his day, for whom Langley Field is named. They were wonderful theorists on how a machine could be made to fly, but neither one of them had ever set foot on such a machine or ever intended to. Wilbur said there are two ways to train a wild horse. One is to sit on the fence and take notes and then go to a comfortable chair and write an essay on how to train that horse. The other is to go and get on the horse and ride it. And he said that has been our procedure. And every time they went up in their plane or their gliders, every single time they knew they were risking their lives. They could be killed. And because of that, they never flew together, because they wanted to be sure that if one of them got killed, the other would be still alive to carry on with the quest, with the mission. And it was only in 1910, when they knew that they'd really done what their whole life's efforts had been focused to do, that they had accomplished it, that they had a big showing, air show, we'd call it today, at Huffman Prairie outside of Dayton, a cow pasture, which is where they'd done so much of their most important work, where they invited the town to come out and watch. And they both went up together, which was their way of saying, we've done it. And they had. And Wilbur, alas, only lived 2 more years. He died, unfortunately, of typhoid fever in 1912 when he was still in his 40s. And there's a tremendous sort of Greek tragedy irony about that, because the father was constantly warning the children to beware of impure water. Always be sure you know the water's clean. And Orville had very nearly died of typhoid fever when he was still a teenager, and then Wilbur succumbs to it. But I think it's a reminder, too, that this was a time when life was not the way it is now. And you could die from bad water, just as you could die from other maladies that we are no longer concerned about. And to me, one of the most phenomenal things of all, Ken, is that, as you well know, 1903, when Orville made his first flight, was not very long ago as history goes. And yet, we live in the world where aviation is everywhere. It has been played a often horrifying part in the dreadful wars of our lifetime and before. And yet, I could have known Orville Wright. Many of you here tonight could have known Orville Wright. He didn't die until 1948. So as history goes, this was just the other day. And the idea that most people know nothing about them, I knew nothing about them when I first started on this project, is to me a mistake. And it's too bad. And I think that with all the emphasis we're putting today on innovation, all these young people who want to get into startup ventures of this and that kind, and the importance of innovation to our future, to our economy, I think that everybody in that field ought to read the story of Orville and Wilbur Wright, and to see how much more there is to it than just being smart or brilliant or advantaged with some position in a place where you can rub elbows with other people who are involved with innovation.
I loved in the book this sort of combination. It's not naivete. They're simple. They're direct. And their pockets can't be picked. What's so great about your book is you have all of these darker shadows that are sort of on the outside. There's, I think, a wonderful scene, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds of the engineering of it, where you have these two theorists, as you were talking about, Lilienthal and Chanute, who've got sets of ratios that they're sure going to work that will affect what's called camber. And the Wright brothers originally work with their own ratios and have success. Then in their next trial, they go to use Lilienthal's and Chanute, and nothing works.
Right.
And it proves that. And it also proves in business thing. You're always on the edge of your seat reading this book thinking, oh no, now somebody's going to take advantage and this is going to turn into, and they were always so resolutely themselves that they resisted the temptations of the quick buck for something else. It's very, very impressive, particularly Wilbur, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to read something, if I may. May I borrow this? I think in many ways one of my favorite parts of the whole book is their story, is when they first get to Kitty Hawk on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which were very remote in that day because there was no bridge over there or anything of that kind. And only a few people lived there, and they lived a very primitive life, to say the least. And so you have these two young men from out west in Ohio who show up in business suits and wear coats and ties
every day,
as if they're walking down the street in Dayton. And the reaction to among the local people, I think, is absolutely wonderful. And one of the chroniclers of all of that was a man named John T. Daniels, who was served as one of the workers, one of the rescue teams in the life-saving station. And he was a great, big, powerful fellow who was good at lifting the plane when they needed to move it. One named John T. Daniels, known as John T. to distinguish him from his father, who was also John Daniels, said later, "We couldn't help thinking they were just a pair of poor nuts. They'd stand on the beach for hours at a time just looking at the gulls flying, soaring and dipping. Gannets, the giant seabirds with a wingspread of 5 to 6 feet, seemed their particular interest. They would watch the gannets and imitate the movements of their wings with their arms and hands. They could imitate every movement of the wings of those gannets, We thought they were crazy. But we just had to admire the way they could move their arms this way and that, and bend their elbows and wrist bones, and up and down and which way, just like the gannets. Learning the secret of flight from a bird, Orville would later say, was a good deal like learning the secret of magic from a magician. What they were looking at was the birds that could stay aloft without flapping their wings. How did they do that? How did they ride the wind? How did they understand the waves of the wind? And how did they bank and turn and all the rest? And no one had ever really taken that acute interest in watching what was so evident in the skies above us. And of course, people like John T. Daniels soon came to realize that these were remarkable men, and as he himself said, the workingest boys I ever saw in my life. And for someone on the Outer Banks to say that was really the highest compliment they could pay. And the ability of these brothers not to let that kind of ridicule, scorn, divert them or discourage them in the slightest. And they got more of it back home. It wasn't until they got back home when they could develop a plane that would bank and turn. This was after the first flight. And all the first flight really did was to take off, fly, as Ken said, not very far, and land. But they didn't know how to turn it yet. So it was at Huffman Prairie, this cow pasture outside of Dayton, where in 2 years they developed a plane that could do all of those things. And even when they did it, no one paid any attention to it. They would urge the local newspaper people to come out and watch to see what they were doing. No interest, because they knew man can't fly, therefore these people aren't flying, therefore they're crackpots. And the United States government slammed the door in their faces over 4 times, saying we're not interested. Scientific American showed no interest. It wasn't until a delegation showed up from France saying, we're very interested in what you're doing. We wanted to meet you. You bring what you can do over to France, demonstrate for us, and we will be very interested in purchasing your machines.
And then it's published in Gleanings in Bee Culture.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. There was a little fellow named Amos Root who published a beekeeper's magazine. And Amos Root was a marvelous little fellow, and he'd made a fortune selling bee equipment to beekeepers. Beekeeping was a huge part of rural life, American life, then, much more than most of us realize. And he heard about the brothers, and he wrote them and said he was interested to come and see what they were doing. And they took his interest to be serious, so they invited him to come down. He saw what they were doing, and he wrote an article about it that was both thorough and accurate. And he published it in his beekeeping magazine. It was the first article to appear in print, accurate article, about what they had done. He offered it to Scientific American, telling him they could have it for nothing, and they took no interest. They never even answered his letter. So it's a wonderful example of how we human beings can just shut our eyes and our minds to something that's self-evident, because we know that it can't be true. It was not until 1908, when Wilbur flew his demonstration flights at Le Mans in France, that the world suddenly realized man could fly.
So here we have 1900 is the first time they arrive at Kitty Hawk.
8 years.
They return there, and then there's Huffman Prairie. I think for most of us, as part of that just conventional little wisdom, we say Kitty Hawk. I know that. North Carolina license plate, first in flight. But Huffman Prairie is important, and then we migrate to France, and Le Mans becomes a hugely important thing. I mean, you've indicated why, that the French are the only people showing real interest in this flying machine, and they've got a long tradition of at least scholarship as well as some entrepreneurs that are trying it. But it really, the real stuff begins to happen in Huffman Prairie and then in France.
And Huffman Prairie, by the way, is still there exactly as it was. It's been preserved by the U.S. Air Force. It's now part of Wright-Patterson Field. And the house in which the Wrights grew up and their bicycle shop are both at the Ford Museum in Dearborn, exactly as they were. That house, they grew up in a house with no running water, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no telephone, but full of books. Full of books and full of readers. They all read all the time. When their sister Catherine was about to have a birthday, the brother's birthday present to her was a small bust of Sir Walter Scott, her favorite author. So this was, and then when Wilbur arrived in Paris, the French were just floored by how much he knew about European history, how much he knew about art and music and architecture. He wrote wonderful letters home from Paris to his father and his sister, describing those buildings that he thought were the most brilliant of the great architectural treasures of Paris, and those which he thought were overrated. He wrote wonderful letters to both his father and his sister about the hours he spent in the Louvre studying paintings. Now, this is a bicycle mechanic from Dayton, Ohio, who can't speak a word of French, and the French think he's wonderful. And one of the reasons they think he's wonderful is he isn't trying to act like a Frenchman. Right. And they say so. No American had ever been so popular in France since Benjamin Franklin as Wilbur Wright. And with very good reason, I think. They loved his modesty and his determination to succeed, and his courage. Must never underestimate. But he also had the courage of his convictions. He was sure they could do it. And he was right, they did. And always when they succeeded in one step, their eye was on the next step, up until the time when they perfected the whole thing and went up in the plane together.
So when they're in Kitty Hawk, originally,
yeah,
they've got a glider.
Right.
But then, so their bicycle, we can make that. Orville's a printer first, and then is a bicycle mechanic, and they're working together.
Yep.
They've got a going concern. It keeps growing in Dayton, Ohio, the incubator of genius. And you can sort of see how gliders and bikes, you could do this, but then they've got to add a motor to it in order to sustain that flight. And they have a marvelous assistant who they've got working for them in Charlie Taylor, who's working in the bike shop, and they're flying way ahead of everybody else by just taking a simple internal combustion engine, modifying it, and putting it on their glider.
Yes, but also they made it out of aluminum. And nobody had ever made an aluminum engine. And the Wrights and Charlie Taylor had never made a motor in their life. They were doing it all from scratch. That's what's so phenomenal. They're self-teaching themselves everything. And when the aluminum block of the motor, when they first tested it, broke, they went right back to the Aluminum Company of America, this embryonic little company in Pittsburgh, PA, and asked for another one. They didn't give up. They would not give up. I think anyone that went through that mosquito attack, they were subjected to.
One of my questions is skeeters.
Yeah.
I mean, just surviving in Kitty Hawk when they attack.
I don't think there's maybe four of us in this whole audience tonight that wouldn't have gotten up and headed right back home the next morning after that attack. It was unbelievable. And the storms and the floods and the crashes. Orville Wright crashed at Fort Myer across the Potomac from Washington, the Army base there, still there. And with him was a young lieutenant officer who was interested in aviation named Selfridge, who was killed and was the first fatality in the history of aviation. Only a few days earlier, the two different newspapers in Washington ran articles saying that Theodore Roosevelt, the president, was very interested in going out to Fort Myer and going up for a test flight with Orville Wright. It could have been him instead of young Selfridge, who was on that plane, very easily.
Very easy.
And he would be the first president ever to fly in a plane later on. It wasn't with the Wright brothers. But while Selfridge was killed, Orville was very nearly killed and was damaged seriously, both physically and emotionally. And as soon as His sister, Catherine, who was a high school teacher, taught Greek and Latin at the local high school in Dayton, heard that this had happened in mid-afternoon. She called the principal, said she was taking an extended leave of absence. She packed her bags and was on the next train to Washington and stayed with him at his bedside for the next month and several weeks, not only looking at making sure he got all the attention for his physical difficulties as possible, but boosting his spirits and in many ways, I think, saving him. And he would eventually insist on flying again, and would eventually insist on flying again at Fort Myer, and would break world records when he went up again. They would not give up, no matter what. And I think there's a great lesson to be learned in that. Nor would they ever blame other people, or whine, or lapse into self-pity, or attack their competitors, ever.
I love the phrase, "Cheer up, boys, there's no hope."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, what oozes from the pages of this wonderful, wonderful.
And they had a terrific sense of humor.
Is their sense of humor, this sort of very dry, very serious sense of humor. But the commendable thing is they didn't take themselves too seriously and took everything else deadly serious.
And they never changed.
And they never changed. It's
no matter how famous they got, they was exactly the same.
I love it. And they are surrounded. Could you talk a little bit? I mean, there's some great characters, and it's worth reading the book to get all the various aviators and all the folks in the U.S. government and the corporations and the Frenchmen and stuff like that. But two people, the bishop and Catherine, the sister. I mean, you've seen her medal by dropping everything to serve Orville at that incredibly difficult moment. But these are two people where you think that these guys they can't really make it without the support.
Yeah, the father, I don't think that the story would have come out the way it did had Catherine not been part of it.
I agree.
And I think you could say the same for the bishop. Bishop was an amazing man, and he kept a phenomenal diary, which has been a treasure house for me or anyone who writes about the Wright brothers. I keep talking about letters and diaries. We don't write letters anymore, alas, and nobody in public life would dare keep a diary because it can be subpoenaed and used against you. But
or an official cell phone.
Well, you can erase some of that. Every time that Ken or I go to work on a project, there's always that hope that maybe you'll find something new, something that nobody's seen before, noticed before. And it's happened with every book I've undertaken, and I'm very happy to say it's happened again with this book. When Wilbur was about 18, he was playing hockey with a gang of local neighborhood boys on an ice pond, and he got hit in the teeth with a hockey stick, and it knocked out all of his upper teeth and left him in terrible pain and swollen, painful jaw for weeks. And he also lapsed into a spell of depression, we'd call it today, melancholy they would call it then, and became a self-imposed recluse, living at home, very seldom ever going out to do anything with anyone, for 3 years. And he was going to go to college. He wanted to go to Yale. And he certainly would have gotten in, and he would have probably done all kinds of wonderful things, who knows what. But he never did. Instead, he stayed at home and started reading with an intensity greater than anything that he'd attempted before. And it was at that point that the path of his life took a swerve in a very different direction, which consequently led to a very different direction for history in general. So the question was, who hit him with a hockey stick? And did he do it intentionally, or was it an accident? Well, in 1913, which was a full year after Wilbur had died, Bishop Wright puts a notation in his diary saying that the boy who hit him with a hockey stick was a man named Octave Howe, H-A-U-J-A, Oliver Howe, H-O-U-H-A-U-G-H. Oliver Howe later became one of the most notorious murderers in the history of Ohio. He murdered his father, his mother, his brother, and an estimated 12 other people. And he'd been executed in 1906. Well, we did some research on him because, needless to say, after he became famous as this murderer, there was much written about him. Well, he was the neighborhood bully. And he lived right around the corner from the Wrights. And he was very poor because his father was a house painter. They had a number of children. And because they were poor, he worked as a clerk in the local drugstore, and he suffered from rotting teeth. And the druggist, feeling very sorry for this boy, tried to help alleviate his pain by giving him the only painkiller of the day, which was cocaine. And he became addicted to cocaine and had to be institutionalized in the hospital. Later became addicted to alcohol and lapsed into this homicidal career. Now, we don't know whether he did it intentionally or accidentally, but I think it's a very important element in the story because it reminds us that this marvelous setting that they grew up in was not exactly a Norman Rockwell Saturday Evening Post cover kind of thing. There were tragedies. There were people suffering. There was difference between poverty and the lack thereof. And the idea that these two young men would come out of that same neighborhood, to me, is infinitely fascinating and makes it, again, an infinitely more human story. I think, too, that, and I hope you'll agree, that the part that Catherine plays, which has not been made much of by anybody before, is of supreme importance. She reminds me very much of Emily Roebling.
Indeed.
And of Abigail Adams. But in different ways, because she was feisty, she was opinionated, she could get very mad, wrathy, as she said.
Wrathy, that's...
Yeah, and she was funny, and she was always there when they needed her. And she was bright. She was a tiny little woman, about 5'1", tied her hair back in a bun, had gold-rimmed pince-nez glasses. She looked like the essence of a schoolmarm. And she was a great bicycle rider.
So the memories of reading this book, gobbling it up, and the parallel experience of nearly 40 years ago reading the Brooklyn Bridge book, I was reminded about how much you allow the voice of the past, whether it's the letters or the diaries, to live. How much that's influenced me by adding first-person voices to the third-person narration to sort of complement.
Well, it's exactly what you do, dear friend, because we let them speak for themselves.
And then you hear the way they speak. You hear both the style of articulation of the time and how they were, but you also realize how very much like us they were, too.
Yes.
That they have a humanity, that it isn't a Norman Rockwell painting, that it doesn't have this kind of cliched sense of it. These are complicated life, as everyone in this room has. And I would love, before we move to the questions from the audience, for you just to read, very late, Wilbur, I don't want to give too much away, is receiving a great honor in France. And I've taken a part of a quote there.
Thank you.
And I'd love you to read it. It's from, I believe I understand it.
Are you worried I might put them to sleep?
I believe it's the French transcribing his English. And then here is, this is Wilbur Wright, clearly the genius of it. It couldn't have been done without both of them. But this is the man who I think speaks for the family and for the age.
This was a white tie dinner of the elite of intellectual Paris, given in what was the Automobile Club then, and still is, in a room, a palatial banquet room that's still there in Paris on the Champs-Élysées. And it's delivered in English, and as Ken said, was translated as he spoke by Wilbur. For myself and my brother, I thank you for the honor you are doing us and for the cordial reception you have tendered us this evening. Orville was not there. If I'd been born in your beautiful country and had grown up among you, I could not have expected a warmer welcome than has just been given me. When we did not know each other, we had no confidence in each other. Today, when we are acquainted, it is otherwise. We believe each other, and we are friends. I thank you for this. In the enthusiasm being shown around me, I see not merely an outburst intended to glorify a person, but a tribute to an idea that has always impassioned mankind. I sometimes think that the desire to fly, after the fashion of birds, is an ideal handed down to us by our ancestors, who in their grueling travels across trackless lands in prehistoric times looked enviously on the birds, soaring freely through space at full speed, above all obstacles, on the infinite highway of the air.
That's fantastic. I was also struck by a quote you had from William Dean Howells, who said, people had the courage of their dreams.
Absolutely.
I think that if that characterizes...
And a good Ohio man.
And good Ohio man, exactly. I would add that. So let me go to some of your questions, and we'll try to do this in a lightning round to get as many in. But the first one I can reject. Ladies, he is married. His wife is in the audience, please. The great Rosalie McCullough.
May I interrupt a minute? One of the lessons of history is almost nothing of consequence is accomplished alone.
Exactly.
And there's never more true than a book, particularly the kind of book that I write. And all those people, authors of history and biography include in their acknowledgments, are all people that really contributed. But no one has contributed to this book or to all of my books the way my editor-in-chief has, my mission control, my guiding star, my dear wife, Rosalie. Would you stand up, please?
Let me unfairly pile on and say, most helpful of all, most encouraging, inspiring, and indispensable, as always, and most deserving of my wholehearted gratitude is my editor-in-chief and guiding star, my wife, Rosalie.
Yeah.
That's a good way to end an acknowledgement, let me tell you, and that's very, very
60
true.
years married this year.
Okay.
We're off to a good start.
Yeah, right, yeah. You've had a good half century and then some, yeah. Ohio and North Carolina both claim to be the birthplace of aviation. Can you settle this?
No, they are both the birthplaces of aviation. The first plane ever to fly happened in North Carolina. The first practical plane to take to the air happened in Dayton, Ohio.
Has there been a historical figure whom you wanted to do a book on, but felt it was too daunting an undertaking?
No.
We like to bite off more than we can chew and then figure out how to chew
we always are.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always bigger than you think it is.
Yeah, always. You have written many excellent books. What's your favorite and why?
For me, it would be saying which is my favorite child. I can't do that. I would say, generally speaking, it's always the one I've been working on, and now this book right now is my favorite. But who knows what will follow.
Yeah, you have 5 children, I believe.
Yes, we have 5
and
children.
numerous grandchildren, and
Yeah.
I have 4 daughters, and I always say exactly that. I have copped out, since we made our series on jazz, by what Duke Ellington, our most prolific composer, 2,500 compositions, when asked what his most important one, he says, the one I'm working on now, and moves it right along. How many languages do you speak?
1.
And
not always that well.
Well,
Yeah.
I think we can safely say not only one well, but writes it very well too.
I can get by pretty well in Italy, but using my arms.
Yeah. You know, Jacques Barzin said that the French were Italians in bad moods. Could you please comment on the process you go through when choosing research and writing about a particular topic?
Well, when I first started out, I thought the way you do this, I was an English major in college, and I really knew nothing about doing historical research or writing a history or biography. I knew I wanted to write, and I had a story I wanted to tell. So my thought was I should do all the research and then write the book, but I very quickly found that I wanted to do both at the same time. You do enough research to get yourself motivated and sufficiently knowledgeable to write a few passable chapters. Because it's when you get writing that you realize how much you don't know and what specifically you need to find out. So I'm doing research all the way through, all the time. I have a wonderful research assistant with whom I've worked now for over 30 years, Mike Hill, who's also worked with Ken. He's the best in the business.
Indeed.
And he lives outside of Washington, so he can cover the Smithsonian and Library of Congress and National Archives and all that. And the amount of reading that goes into any project of this sort is enormous, far more than most people realize. And part of the problem, for me at least, is I love to read, but when I'm in a book, working on a book, I really have no time or desire to read anything but what I need to know to do the book. So I get starved for reading good fiction mainly, which I adore. And so right now I'm back reading again, and I was so sorry to read about Ruth Rendell's death. She was absolutely marvelous writer, one of my favorites of all, wrote marvelous detective novels, but they're much more than that. They were great novels. And I think that I like people who can tell a story well. I remember Barbara Tuchman, one of the first books that really impressed me was Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August. And I remember she read, there's no secret to history, teaching history or writing history, tell stories. And so that's what the research is about. And you can't make anything up. You can't jiggle the statistics or the facts to suit your own desires. But so often, the truth is more interesting than fiction. It really, truly is. And there are things that happen in real life that if you put them in a novel, your editor would tell you to take it out because it's unbelievable. Imagine Jefferson and Adams dying on the same day, and it's the 4th of July. No, that wouldn't happen in real life.
50 years to the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And also, you have to have a terrific editor. And I have a terrific editor. I've had 3 terrific editors, Peter Schwade, Michael Korda, and Bob Bender. Bob's here tonight, and he's tops. And your publisher is very important. I've had the same publisher for 50 years, and Simon & Schuster, I wouldn't change. Why should I want to change? And I always felt if I was loyal to them, they'd be loyal to me, and they sure have. And I feel so lucky that they have been my publisher all along. I think the world of Simon & Schuster and the people who run it.
You have a background in painting, and there is something very visual about your writing. It makes for good movies. Other people get inspired by what you do and make movies or mini-series about it. And your books are always, sometimes the photographs in the middle are kind of afterthoughts, and yours are not. They're very carefully curated. Can you talk about that part of you that is so visually oriented, the painter in you?
Well, I thought at first I would be a painter, and I still paint, and I think it's something that anyone who wants to write should do, is take lessons in painting or drawing, because it teaches you to see, to really look. And Dickens said, "Make me see." That's what a writer's business was about. And I'm very interested in, as you know, Ken, in photography, and it was because of photographs I saw way back in the 1960s at the Library of Congress of what happened at Johnstown when the dam broke in the mountains in 1889, that I got interested in the subject and took that on as my first book. And I used photographs as a source, a resource for research, because by looking at photographs, you can see things that are often not available to be seen in what's available in print. Just as paintings are very valuable. If you're working in the 18th century, when there were no photographs, you go to study the paintings. What color were his eyes? What really did he look like? The paintings of John Trumbull, for example, of all the founders, absolutely invaluable to anyone who wants to write about that time and those people. Everything about Trumbull's famous painting of the 4th of July, 1776, is inaccurate. The whole scene is inaccurate. It never took place. But what is accurate in detail are the faces. And that is of utmost importance, because every one of those men who signed that document was signing his death certificate. He was revealing that he was a traitor, and it was therefore accountable. So it's a very brave thing to have your portrait in that painting. And all those studies that Trumbull did of the faces, the drawings, and not just the painting, are all available to be seen in the collection at Yale. And they were of the utmost value to me in doing the research for my John Adams books and for 1776.
You brought this up earlier, and a recurring theme in some of the questions is this anxiety that we don't write letters anymore.
Oh, yeah.
We'll have the email hard drives, we hope, and maybe 100 years from now we'll know how to read them. But what's your worry, or do you have a worry? Do you just think that we'll figure out a way to get inside folks the way you've
Well, I don't know what they'll work with in the future, and I know that Jim Billington, the head of the Library of Congress, is very concerned about it, and they're trying to figure out what to do. We don't know how long the electronic communications will last. But nobody writes letters, and the letters that go out as email are hardly in the English language. And young people today
don't even do that.
It's sad. I was just talking with Mort Janklow, my agent, and Linda, his wife, this evening, that almost half of the business schools in the country now require their incoming freshmen to take a basic course in how to write a letter. And they're all these people, of course, these freshmen are all college graduates. And they can't write a presentable letter or report or analysis and so forth, and they need to learn how to do that. And I gave a talk at the Tuck Business School at Dartmouth recently, and I urged these young people to take a look at this Wright Brothers story, because there's an absolutely shining example of two people who had none of the advantages of going to college or the Tuck Business School, who could write superbly. And it's valuable. What's the name of Charlie, Walter, the great investment.
Warren Buffett?
Warren Buffett's partner, Charlie
Munger.
Charlie Munger, in Charlie Munger's autobiography, he said, "I never knew a leader who wasn't a reader." And that's so true. John Adams said, "You'll never be alone with a poet in your pocket." How wonderful. And we can all still carry a poet in our pocket. And maybe 15 volumes of poetry on one of these little...
In our bio.
Yeah.
That may be the advantage there.
And young people should be taught to read up, read above their heads. Read writers that they think are a little hard for them to understand. Read good writing. That's how you get into the rhythm of it. Willa Cather used to sit down with something really well written before she started each day, often reading the Bible. I don't think it was for religious reasons. I think she really wanted to get that feeling of cadence and power.
This is one, and maybe given the time, we might go out on this. Dear Mr. McCullough, I just love you. As a Pittsburgher, would you consider writing a book about our wonderful city? P.S. Congratulations on your bridge.
Thank you. I had a bridge named for me in Pittsburgh, which was about as big an honor as anyone could get. And I'm thrilled about it. And it's not just any old bridge. It's the 16th Street Bridge, which was designed by the same architect who designed Grand Central. And the engineer in charge was the structural engineer for the Empire State Building. So they went and got big talent to do that job. And Pittsburgh is a story city. I think all river cities are story cities. And I know other writers have felt that way, including somebody named Twain, I think.
Not a lot of literature about Las Vegas or Phoenix.
Or that's printable.
Yeah, it's printable.
Yes, I have seriously considered doing a book about Pittsburgh. I keep a running list of possible future books, but I've promised myself and my family that I won't look at it until next fall.
I've got several questions here that are about many other claims to being the first flight. Gustav Whitehead, Alberto Dumont. I mean, even going in, and I thought you'd do an expert job at the end of the book of swatting away a few of these things, which we in the history trade are constantly having to do.
Yes.
Wasn't Meriwether Lewis murdered?
Yes. Well, you do know, for example, that we didn't really land on the moon.
No. There's a stage.
It was all done with special effects.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Or Oswald didn't kill Kennedy.
No.
Yeah. No, I don't know why. There's no evidence whatever for the Whitehead claim. People who knew him claimed that he never flew anything, and when he went to demonstrate what he could do with his plane, it didn't work. It's just somehow this story erupts or comes back to the surface about every 35, 40 years. And it's been going on for a long time. This is the 1930s. Yes, other people were experimenting, but mostly the only successful ones were in France. But when Wilbur came to France and flew, people like Blériot and Delagrange all said, he's way ahead of all.
Way ahead.
And they were. They were way ahead of everybody. Thrilling. It was absolutely thrilling.
I find one of the wonderful things in the Who Are Those Guys within this book are all these other parallel attempts, scientific and real. People trying to take off in the Potomac and splashing, and you have this a real kind of almost a great race that's going on. If not simultaneously, then at least you realize that if they hadn't done it.
Yeah.
And maybe I think we will go out on this last question. This is a good one. As a high school student, I am constantly being flooded with stories with the underlying message of anything is possible if you set your mind to it. The story of the Wright brothers seems to be no exception. But if the Wright brothers were really geniuses, as you say, how can I, just a normal person from a very privileged upbringing, quite unlike the Wright brothers, expect to be able to accomplish something so amazing?
That's a very, very good question. And it might be said, I think in fairness, that if Wilbur had not been a genius, it wouldn't have worked. But Orville was not a genius, nor was Charlie Taylor, nor was Catherine Wright, nor was Milton Wright. They're all working together. And so the part you might play might not be the brilliant mind that can break through where no mind ever has gone before, but you can be part of something like that. I don't think that that's the message to take from this story. To me, what is elemental is that we Americans, and I'm not being jingoistic about this, we Americans have from the beginning had a certain knack of solving problems that was different from other civilizations, other ways of life, societies. Our country is in itself innovation. And innovation and the solving of problems is how we have built the country. I think, for example, that future historians will look upon this time and they will see that the phenomenal accomplishments are not what we think are the phenomenal accomplishments. One will be medicine. Imagine what's happened in medicine in our lifetime in this country. Revolutionary. The second is, though our universities and colleges have problems, and their expense is a big part of it, we have nonetheless, in this free country, created the greatest universities in all the world, the greatest universities in all history. And that is a momentous accomplishment. If these were cathedrals rising on the horizon, we'd all stand back and say, that's Chartres Cathedral. But we don't see it that way because we're too much involved with what we're all doing. And the whole idea of education is central to all what this is about. Jefferson said, any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. And that's an underlying theme in our way of life. I think the primary lesson to be learned from the Wright Brothers story is the virtue and the advantage and the enlargement of life that comes with having high purpose. And that focuses your life. That's what makes you want to get up out of bed in the morning and get back to work.
Ladies and gentlemen, David McCullough.